Today we have a very exciting panel here of teams who are building really interesting infrastructure in Web3. And so before we begin, why don't we start with a row of introductions, and then we can continue on from there.
I can start?
Yes.
My name is Garrison. I'm the VP of Growth at Avalanche.
I'm Andrew. I'm the VP of Business Development at Immutable.
And I'm Ryan. I'm on the BD team at Polygon, and I oversee our gaming pipeline.
Cool. And my name is Jin. I'm from the Saga team. And we would love to chat today about Web3 infrastructure. So in your opinion right now, in infrastructure, what's going well and what's not going well? And let's begin the journey with conversations just generally about infrastructure, and then let's hone in a little bit into the gaming side of things.
We're going in order?
Jump in whenever you're familiar. This is pretty casual.
All right,
so.
yeah, we'll keep it casual. So, we've done an incredible job building blockchains. And I think we can all agree that there's a lot of options for chains out there, right? And what we've not done well is all the really unsexy piping that goes in making those blockchains usable for companies. I was talking to someone this morning upstairs, and I was saying, where's my CDP for Web3? How many Web3 games do you know that have telemetry built in? Who's doing DevOps? How do people monitor what's going well or not going well in their dApps? None of that exists, and that's why we run into all these really strange problems that we solved 10 years ago in Web3 gaming, because everyone is focused on building the blockchain, right? Super sexy, it's super new, but no one is building everything else. Something that we've been pointing at as games, the more advanced games, right? Like a bunch of games on Immutable, Shrapnel, Godzilla, games that are building on Avalanche, go to market. Who's generating tax forms for players? How is a US citizen going to play a game and generate thousands of transactions a year and be compliant? Who's doing that, right? And so those little pieces of tooling that make gaming viable, we haven't built yet.
Maybe just to add to that, I think one of the things that we see is the space is very fractured. There are so many options, so many tool sets. So if you're a game developer and you're trying to get into the space, you probably have a pedigree. You came from, AAA studio. You're very well funded. You're looking at all the options. We all sound the same. We're all saying the same stuff, right? But at the end of the day, really, you have to stack all the different Lego blocks. You got to pick a scaling solution. You have to then think about what wallet looks like, all the different tooling, as Garrison was just saying. And so from our perspective, I don't think we've done a good enough job of just making it easier for game devs ultimately to jump into the space and to really think about, hey, how are we actually adding Web3 into the game, into the economy? So I think we still have a really long way to go. At Immutable, we like to think that ultimately we're a platform, and we like to simplify that experience for game devs. So you don't have to have someone who knows how to. You don't have to hire a Solidity dev, for example. You don't have to stack all these pieces. It's actually really easy. And what do you do instead? You focus on shipping the game, building a really high quality experience that really is gameplay first, and then fun. Hooks the users in, and then let's add some Web3 elements into that.
Ryan, would you like to?
I would just agree with everything. I think, honestly, we're all kind of on board with there's a long way to go. And I think in the future, with a lot of the infrastructure, we'll see quite a bit of consolidation, just because there's so many projects that are building more or less the same iterations. No one's really found product market fit yet. So it's really just working alongside developers, really understanding their challenges, ensuring that, we're actually solving some of their challenges. I think on the infrastructure side, the back-end tooling has been very prevalent. But what I'm seeing at Polygon more than anything right now is a lot focus on the UA side of things, the go-to-market, just because there's been hundreds of millions of dollars invested in games in the past year and a half. They're finally going to market. There's so many games out there, and it's now about how do you get this in front of the right person? So that's I'd say the most recent on the infrastructure side that we're seeing.
Interesting. So we mentioned a lot of these kind of ancillary things besides the actual hard blockchain solution out there that we need more support for. But a lot of the things you mentioned already exists in the world today, right? It's just not Web3. And so do you think the direction in that case is talking to those firms and services that exist already? Or do you think Web3 is just a completely different beast where you have to start from scratch and maybe something that won't be such compatible with the models that exist today? And I'm not sure if you've experienced something like this. I'm sure some part of it, there's always some friction going back to these service providers. So
I think like maybe we spent a lot of time over the last kind of couple of years just thinking, maybe focusing on the wrong area. We seem to have thought that maybe blockchains are going to bring users to games and solve all these problems, right? And at the end of the day, maybe there's just a bit of a misconception. In 2 years' time, this is all just going to be gaming. It's just going to be gaming. We're not going to say like, oh, blockchain gaming. It's just going to be gaming with blockchain elements where people can actually own their assets, do what they want with them, trade them, have these economies, right? And so from our perspective, I think maybe building a little bit on what on what Ryan said, one of the things that we really see is there is a huge need. Like, what do games need when they go live? They obviously want to launch and they want to attract users. There's a huge need, and we're seeing that from every project right now. So I feel like we've missed that a little bit, but this all exists, right? Like, to launch a game, you know what you need to do. You go get a publishing deal, you spend some, you be smart, spend some on UA. All that exists. It's not necessarily new. Web3 just adds some friction. I think the infrastructure has a long ways to go. And so I don't necessarily think that there's anything that needs to be reinvented. And so, we see ourselves playing an important role there as well. For example, the Immutable passport is a component that ultimately is like it's like a gamer identity. Think of it as Steam for kind of Web3. Every game that's building, including our own, we have 5 IPs that we're going to be spending millions of dollars in terms of budget to attract gamers to this ecosystem. We see ourselves as playing a role to kind of say, hey, how can we help with some of that? But these aren't new challenges. Games need users, and we ultimately think that it's quite similar to what we would call in Web 2.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's super well said. If it wasn't for how financialized blockchains were, we wouldn't even be having this conversation, right? Like blockchains, just like compute, highly commoditized, very accessible, very homogenous. And the only reason why we're talking about it this way is because there's an immense transfer of value, and because there's a lot of money involved, everyone's very interested in building their own version of it, right? To sort of your question, though, on how some of this tooling already exists in traditional gaming infrastructure, I think the theme of what we're talking about today is that we haven't yet seen what is going to be built. And my personal opinion is that it would be a bit of a shame if we let the traditional players just expand into Web3 the way that they do things today, right? Mm-hmm. I like seeing Web3 natives build things because not only are they making it interoperable with Web3, but they're also rethinking some of the challenges that exist within the Web2 stack, right? Which is not perfect either. So
what's interesting also when I think about Web3 infrastructure is, at the end of the day, at Saga, we like to think about blockchain kind of similarly to how AWS kind of thinks about compute and allowing for cloud-based compute, essentially. And the concept is pretty similar, but now it's decentralized. However, the funny thing about this whole situation is you don't expect AWS to bring in users for games. Like, that's not a thing or a concept that really exists. And so the reason why this exists is because, as you mentioned, there's communities and value associated with it, and there's communities because of that. And people are expecting kind of users to come in. And one of the things that's really interesting is that I think a lot of these infrastructure and service providers that are ancillary to the actual blockchain are not familiar with this model of the infrastructure bringing in a set of eyeballs and community, essentially. So how do we start bridging that, and how do we help these service provider come into Web3 and kind of change their business model a little bit ultimately then?
I mean, I think we need to break that misconception down, right? Avalanche is an ecosystem. We're an infrastructure provider. Mm-hmm. And I think this is sometimes challenging to hear, but we're not a UA partner, right? We build community because there should be a developer community around products that people want to use and build on. But we're not in the business of bringing gamers to projects. We're not in the business of bringing users to a DeFi project. We're not in the business of bringing individual people and telling them that these are products that they should use. We're in the business of delivering blockchains and making sure they work for the developers, right? Like, the chain should not go down. It should be usable. It should be reliable. And as we ask more service providers, whether they're Web2 companies that become interoperable or Web3 native companies, as we ask them to build on our infrastructure, we need to make sure that they understand the relationship that we have. And we're doing a disservice ultimately to service providers and to game developers if we sell them on the premise that if you build on chain, like you're saying, like, you're all of a sudden going to have this category of user that has never existed before.
How do you talk to them about this though? Because it is very unusual, right? This doesn't really exist. It's almost as if, if you just go back into a traditional world, the tool developers have to deal with, let's say, Amazon's stockholders for some reason demanding specific things from you, which is something that doesn't really exist in the paradigm of the existing world. So how do you think service providers should kind of approach this kind of landscape ultimately then?
I'm happy to go. I mean, I don't think I have a ton more to offer since the previous kind of point, because I was leading into that passport element. But ultimately, I think at the end of the day, and if we're focusing specifically on gaming, the approach that we take is how can we be best in service to games? And the single most important thing that we hear, which is very similar to what Ryan said earlier, is this challenge around like, awesome, we know games take 9 to 36 months, depending on the project scope, size, whatever. It's coming around to launch time. We need a launch. We need help with launch. How do we ultimately help them with that UA? And so from our perspective, like we're super focused on that through our offering, through our tooling. Beyond that, there's also post-sales. So like ultimately, what are we seeing across the rest of the portfolio? How can we be of service to them? So we're super, super focused on really building out a network business. Mm-hmm. We believe long-term, this is going to be a network where the value accrual will be most Web3 games will be building in a specific place because they ultimately see value there. Mm-hmm. Don't know if you have a different perspective.
I share that perspective. The value of Polygon or an Avalanche or an Immutable is really the network effect in the ecosystem. And so while my job is not necessarily going to an infrastructure provider and like sending them all of their users or their clients, it's about creating a network that is friendly to developers, that has everyone working together, being interconnected, and that ultimately is what we strive to do, is just be that like glue, so to speak, that makes it easy, because right now it's just not.
Mm-hmm. So then let's dive a little bit deeper into this point, because let's go into specifics. So one of the topics that I was talking about yesterday was live ops. It's like look, a lot of blockchain developers and Web3 developers focus on getting the product right, but that is only, some people say like half or even less than half the amount of work. And so what are the types of infrastructure solutions that companies are demanding from you guys once they actually do launch? Then what are we missing here that we should start targeting more and start focusing on to make the experience a lot better for the developers ultimately?
Gosh, where do we start? I mean,
pick one.
Yeah, where do we start? So, I was having a discussion last night with the Stardust folks, right, who've done a really, really good job in managing some component of live ops for game developers, similar to Immutable, right? Like verticalization of tools so that game developers don't have to think and make decisions about things that they shouldn't have to and can focus on their game is really important. And the subject of gas always comes up, right? Because it's crypto, it's Web3. We think about gas so often. And this idea that if I am more successful, I subject my user, I subject my business to variable gas curves is like a very, very weird thing, right, to think about. And so if I was a developer and I was working with an infrastructure partner, right, and it's not gasless, I'm coming to you and I'm asking for like a guarantee on what my gas cost is going to be. Mm-hmm. I'm asking for guaranteed SLAs on throughput, right? You don't think about, potentially going to your internet service provider and saying, hey, on any given day, I'm going to be able to send packets at this throughput rate. Like, who thinks about that, right? Like, you don't. You just assume that it works and that when I jump on Google Meet, like, it's not going to lag. Mm-hmm. That's what game developers expect out of us as infrastructure providers, mm-hmm. right? And I think the most important thing is that at the end of the day, depending on how you're approaching the market, right? If you want to provide, as the infrastructure layer, tools that are specific for gaming, I think that's fantastic. But the minimum bar that we need to hit is we need to enable live ops, mm-hmm. right? Where we are today as a set of infrastructure partners is, I don't even think that most game developers can see a path where 5 million, 250 million MAUs concurrently could play and not run into issues, mm-hmm. right? Like that's just like, we're just not there. And so I think the whole idea of even enabling live ops is still something that we're all grappling with.
Interesting. Yeah, that's actually one of the things that we've been struggling actually and thinking about with Saga, because when you actually ask most blockchain infrastructure or blockchain companies out there, a lot of them, their goal is to try to increase the throughput of your chain as much as possible without considering the costs of the actual increase. And one of the things that we're doing actually at Saga that's a little bit different is we're going the opposite approach. We're making each chain actually smaller and more compact, such that you, exactly as you mentioned, is to be able to say to somebody who's demanding an actual a throughput number, we can say one chain can deliver this much throughput. If you need more chains, just spin up more chains. More throughput, you need to spin up more chains. And you can kind of make them into little cookie cutter boxes that they can start planning essentially once the game does go live and scale. And so that's something that we've been thinking a lot about. But how does Polygon, for example, think about these kinds of situations?
I mean, our entire approach for, the next indefinite amount of time, but Polygon 2.0 is all about this world of interconnected L2s that make it really seamless for whether you're an IP, a game developer, a bank, doesn't really matter, to build your own app chain. So I think that's certainly, and that's obviously with ZK rollups, something we're really excited about. The vision and final execution is a long way off, but I guess from a gaming standpoint, I still personally am not pushing developers to think through that just yet. Really just because users aren't quite there yet. Does it really make sense when a game developer is still grappling with, how much of my game is on-chain versus off-chain? Where do I think about on-ramps and wallets? For them to start spinning up their app chains, there's some that are doing it because they, have the scale, they have the transaction volume, but it's not necessarily something that right off the bat, we just want to confuse them even more or send them down that path. So I think that's something that, 2024 is definitely going to be a priority. But for now, it's really just making sure they're getting their game live, that, they have all of those components set, and then, long-term scaling that into app chains.
What is the biggest confusion you hear from the game developers when they come and ask you about these kinds of infrastructure questions? You mentioned that you want to make sure that you don't want to explain too much to them because they'll start getting lost.
Yeah.
So where are they getting lost at this point, and how can we look to fix that?
I mean, where? It's a million different things. It really depends on the developer. You have to remember that you have Web3 native devs that really understand the crypto landscape and they don't understand games. And then you have these Web2 game developers that understand live ops and all of the back-end infrastructure, and now they're how do we make this more crypto native? So it's really getting deep with the exact archetype of user, understanding where they're at, where their game is, what type of game it is. There's just so many considerations, so I don't have one specific thing. Yeah.
We could start by not branding everything. That would be useful.
Yeah, and it's confusing because every brand also is a repetition of what already exists in Web 2, but a slightly different name is a lot of the times things we've been noticing a lot in the Web 3 space.
Yeah, we're super good at branding things, it turns out.
Oh, is that right? Wait, give me an example.
I mean, we've got supernets, rollups, chainlets.
Oh, yeah.
We've got 50 different ways to describe the same thing.
You forgot platform.
Platform, right? App chains. My goodness, if I was a developer, and I was and I wanted to build on chain because I want certain elements of building a blockchain game, and I'm like, what am I buying? Everything is the same thing. It's like when you go to the grocery store and they have free reign to name apples whatever they want. It's just a marketing ploy, right? It's super confusing.
Well, actually, they do that, no?
They do, yeah. You can name an apple whatever you want.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it is confusing.
That's super confusing.
Yeah, because actually, just going. One thing I didn't know this is that they have specific apple types that are trademarked, and so people will take the same seed and then now they'll name it something different because they're not allowed to name it that way. Anyways, this is a huge tangent. But
that's what we do, right?
We should be learning that.
So on Immutable fronts, you guys are a little bit different than the rest of us. We're hard infrastructure, and you guys are probably much more plugged into a lot of the live services stuff that we're talking about. And so tell us a little bit more about your experiences.
Yeah, I'd say a little bit less on the live services, but the easiest way to think about us is we really make it incredibly easy to integrate Web3, to adopt Web3, right? You have the scaling protocols. one on each side here or several on each side. And those are people who are very, very focused on like, hey, how do we actually like build L1 blockchains, whatever that is. We've always thought our role is slightly different. How do we break down those barriers? And so there's a couple different things that we think about, right? As I mentioned earlier, we don't believe that a game studio has to go and hire a large team of Solidity devs, learn this new language, and basically take valuable resources away from shipping a high quality, fun, engaging game, and then go and learn something here and start to experiment with blockchain. So we really break that down. We give people a bunch of tooling around that, whether it be APIs, Unity SDK, Unity and Unreal, rather plugins. The Passport product, which I talked about, which is going to be incredibly important to bring a ton of users to this network. Again, it's a network business, right? It's not necessarily just about, kind of like a base layer protocol. So we've always thought our role is very different. And the reason for that is, like, we actually build games. We started as a games business 5 years ago. Even before Gods Unchained, Etherbots is the game, and Robbie talks about it all the time. You can still play Etherbots, and I think on Ethereum L1, and you play around, and it's probably like 10,000 in gas. But we ran into these issues, and so we figured out that ultimately there's a whole lot more that folks need. So less on the live ops. Like, yes, we run our own games in-house, and we have a game studio, and so we believe that we're very credible when we speak to these projects. And the reason for that is like, don't just trust me on the tech, don't just trust me on the platform. I literally have 5 games over here that have multi-million-dollar UA budgets, and this has to work. So, we have skin in the game here. So our role is very much around breaking down those barriers, simplifying it, and then wrapping tools around that to make it very easy for them. And then, as I mentioned, once they partner with us, there's some services, some support. We look across the ecosystem, who's all building on Immutable. We take best practices and we share that with the rest of everyone else, right? We see what's happening in our studio. Our studio team is run by Justin Hulog, who is the ex-CEO of Riot Asia. Very, very focused on high quality games. We see what's working there and we scale that out. So less necessarily on the live ops. We're not quite there yet. I think there might be some areas where we can help out in the future. One of the areas that we haven't actually really talked about is analytics, which is actually quite interesting. That's starting to come up more and more. I don't have a solution for that necessarily, and we're not really focused on that. But there's a lot of complexity. In short, we try to simplify that, break it down, and give people a best-in-class platform, and then partner with the best-in-class scaling protocols to make their Web3 dreams come true.
Wonderful. So I had an interesting question. Actually, yes. So one of the things that is interesting is both Web3 can be used for many different things, right? So you can use it for DeFi, you can use it for social, you can use it for gaming. And there are very gaming-specific things, and the way that you design a product for game companies is actually very different than designing a product for a DeFi company, for example. How does your team manage this expectation ultimately? Because there might be certain things that are happening on the technology front, essentially, that is optimized more for different use cases that game developers are like, wait, why is this the way that it's done? And I just wanted to start exploring how gaming fits in with the broader infrastructure and how we think about things.
I think one of the things that I've done with our gaming team is to really focus in on the value that we're adding, right? Like you walk into a meeting with a game developer, you start talking about validators and decentralization, and like you can literally see their eyes glaze over. Like, if I'm running a game, why do I care about decentralization? Like, it doesn't really matter, right? Who cares if the game is immutable? Like, sorry, not immutable to change. Who cares if the game is immutable? Like, if I have all these assets and the game shuts down and doesn't recognize the value of these assets, like, even if the value of the asset is recognized in like a marketplace and people are willing to buy it, but I can't use it in a game, like, what's the point, right? And so, I think as a whole, and one thing that I have a ton of respect for Immutable for, right, is that they get games, right? Like they're vertically integrated. They build tools for game developers. And it makes sense, right? They're not trying to sell something that is, generally crypto and Web3 and like fit it into a Web3 game use case, right? And I think for the rest of us, it's important that we're like, one, speaking the language, and two, we're not trying to sell in all these like really random crypto things that games don't need yet.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I mean, to be fair, Immutable is focused on games, but they use infrastructure ultimately that's more generalized, right? So then, how do you see this? Do you, like, when you evaluate what scaling solution to use or what base layer to use, how do you think about these things usually at Immutable?
Yeah, I mean, for us, we've been pretty clear on the thesis since day one. It always has to come back to Ethereum for all the reasons why it's Ethereum. Security, it's the most liquid network. It's really there to stay. And yeah, I mean, it's obviously very common knowledge. We announced a relationship with Polygon that was in March. We took a huge look at the market, and for us, I guess maybe taking half a step back, it has to be Ethereum, but it also for us has to be ZK. We believe that's the only way to scale ultimately, and we have a very strong thesis there. And so we took a look at the market. We looked at everyone. We spoke to many, many, many folks, and we ultimately landed on the Polygon tech ultimately being the best. And so there's a couple different things, but ultimately, again, to Garrison's point, it's if we're starting the conversation with a game dev around hey, you're focusing on the roll up on the protocol we're not setting the dev up. We're not setting the partner up for success. Ultimately, what are they trying to achieve? And how do we ultimately match up the right solution for them? It's no secret. We started on Starkware. They've been a fantastic partner for us for the first kind of 4 or 5 years of our life as a business. And we were very successful. It's actually a very sexy, compelling offering to be completely gas-free. But it was absolutely a part of the market that really needed interoperability, that really needed this EVM component, right? And we knew that. And so it took us a little while. We ultimately, what we feel like at the right time, took a look at all the options out there and landed on what we think ultimately is going to be the best long-term successor. So Ethereum, ZK, and then ultimately kind of from a network perspective, who do we want to align with?
Interesting.
One thing I want to push back on that you mentioned is the gaming infrastructure is so, you didn't say different, but kind of implied different to what you're seeing in DeFi. And I don't know if that's necessarily true. I think the reason why so many projects are so excited about gaming, infrastructure in particular, is because gaming has historically always been really prime testing grounds for new technologies. Mm-hmm. And so not all games, but quite a few games that are Web3 native are really just DeFi that's a little bit more fun and experimental. And so I think regardless of whether some of these companies are specifically gaming infrastructure companies or analytics or any additional tooling, all of them are starting in gaming because that's where a lot of these business models and use cases are going to be tested before they make their way mainstream, whether it's in loyalty, whether it's in finance, whether it's everything else. And so a lot of what we're seeing now, whether it's branded as gaming or not, I personally believe we're going to see in every other industry in the next 5 to 10 years.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Yeah, I think what I meant by gaming is a little different. Is the use cases ultimately is, the technology is the same, but the value for things that are being traded is going to be ultimately different. And this is kind of a thesis that we have within Saga as well, right? So in DeFi, when the goal of it is to transact very large transactions, and that's kind of the focus of it, it's okay if gas is super expensive. If it's $50 a transaction, they'll foot that because they're making, let's say, $500,000 transactions, and it's it doesn't really matter. However, in games, it's kind of existential, right? If everything costs $50, you're like, yeah, this is not going to work. I can't sponsor that. I can't find a sponsor. I don't want to do it. No one's going to do it. So I think that's more of what I was going for. But yes.
Totally agreed there. Yeah, I think Ethereum, where security and probability of outcomes is very important. Those high value transactions like equity investments and fine digital art definitely make sense for base layer.
So I want to go back to Ethereum because you mentioned this. Do game developer ask for Ethereum? This is something that I've been very curious about. Do they, or as you mentioned, developers don't really care about decentralization as much, you're saying. Then does Ethereum matter, right? So I want to just kind of throw that out there.
I think Ethereum does matter. The truth is, right, is that Ethereum has the deepest liquidity. And so depending on how you want to implement blockchain in your game, right? If you've decided that you're building a blockchain game, the blockchain elements are there because you want hyper-financialization of some aspect of your game, then hell yes, the liquidity matters, right? If you're adding blockchain because you think smart contracts enable some novel mechanic and the financialization doesn't matter, then no, it doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. I think we tend to draw a line in the sand and then apply it to everything. But to your point, not only are the use cases in gaming different, the use cases within gaming are very different. People want very different things from blockchain, mm-hmm. right? Not everyone is chasing a way to inject or extract a ton of value out of it.
That's right. Yeah. Sorry. Before, you said something very interesting that I kind of want to dive into. But before,
go ahead.
If you had any comments or.
I mean, not to repeat it, but ultimately for us, Ethereum was a thesis since day one. I think it's like, I don't think devs necessarily ask for it, but I think everyone acknowledges, to Garrison's point, like Ethereum matters. Ethereum has been around obviously for quite a long time. There have been plenty of Ethereum killers, alt L1s, all of that, right, that have come over time, and that just hasn't played out, and Ethereum's only gotten stronger. And I think why it matters and where, for some of the devs, where this really is important is it ultimately comes down to security. Like, it is fundamentally not the right call to say, hey, we're going to have a multi-billion-dollar economy, for example. Let's say you're Call of Duty and you're going to go on chain. You have to really make a decision about, like, what is the most secure place for me? Because without ultimately security, the rest does not matter. It absolutely does not matter. You lose customers, things blow up, like you don't have a business. So that's why Ethereum ultimately, from our perspective, but ultimately we hear that most commonly from game devs.
Cool. Yeah. This is going to be probably the final topic we talk about, but you mentioned that even within gaming, there's different ways that people use Web3 infrastructure. Community is one, financialization is another. You can think about game state, putting it on there and making it extensible. How do you guys think about servicing all these different use cases that people are kind of concocting with, and how do you balance them ultimately? Because the motivations and things that they want are all different, right?
I'm going to bet that our approaches are very different. The Avalanche approach is that we don't want to be the ones to cater to the end use case. Like at the end of the day, we want to be very good at delivering blockchains, full stop, right? And there are a ton of incredible partners, I see some of them in this room, who are building on top of that in a way that allows different game use cases to have the products that they need. I don't think that putting the emphasis on the blockchain provider to cater to the end game developer in every single use case is sustainable or scalable. Like, it's just not what we're good at, right? And we ultimately don't want to make assumptions about what game developers want and box them into a certain way of using blockchain.
I couldn't agree with that more. I think our approach is probably a little bit more similar than we would expect, but for us, it's really just about building like the most comprehensive ecosystem. We want to be as consultative as possible to developers' needs, but at the end of the day, they just want their handheld. They want to say, this is what we're looking for, and then we can come in and deliver. Here are the legitimate partners that we've seen, but it's up to you to go and do that diligence.
Lego block of
exactly. Like we don't have a big enough team to really work alongside from start to finish, but we can certainly make the introductions and partner with the best in class to answer their questions and to make it happen.
Yeah, I think ultimately, like, devs are smart. There's been how many billions of dollars poured into the space, and specifically to fund Web3 games. The developers will figure it out. We have to get out of the way. We have, this kind of full circle back to your initial point, right? We have not done a good enough job. We've made a lot of progress, and kudos to the folks on the stage here carrying the industry forward. We just have not done a good enough job to date breaking down those barriers, making it as simple as possible to adapt, getting out of the way, making this as frictionless as possible, not just for the dev, also for the gamer. That's the ultimate end customer and consumer here, right? So we just got to continue on that path, just continue to break down those barriers, make it as easy as possible, and developers will figure it out. It's a new platform shift. They're smart. It'll happen.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I think with that, we're going to wrap this panel. Thank you very much for your time, and a hand of applause for everybody up here.